In this mini lecture, we're going to talk about the different types of cuttings. First of all, we can classify cuttings by what type of plant organ they come from. So we actually don't have just stem cuttings, but also leaf and root cuttings. A leaf cutting only containing a leaf, and a root cutting only containing part of a root. We'll talk about leaf and root cuttings more in a future lecture, but for now we're going to stick to stem cuttings. So stem cuttings typically have at least two nodes, and you may, if you look up how to propagate a particular plant by stem cuttings, run into references to terminal or axillary stem cuttings. A terminal stem cutting is one that has the terminal bud, and an axillary is one that contains axillary buds only, not the terminal bud. You may also hear the axillary cutting referred to as a subterminal cutting. Same thing. Now, heel and mallet cuttings, that's what you see in the picture here. The middle cutting is a heel cutting. You can see it has a little sliver there at the base. The mallet cutting is the one on the far right. Typically, when you're taking a stem cutting of a woody plant, what's recommended is that you don't take any stem tissue that is older than 1 year old. That's because the older the tissue is, the harder it is for it to dedifferentiate and form adventitious roots. However, in some cases, such as with the heel and mallet cutting, you're keeping a small piece of 2-year-old wood at the base of the 1-year-old wood that makes up most of your cutting. The reason you do that is the plants for which this is recommended have preformed root initials, but they're only in the older wood. So you keep that little sliver of old wood at the base of the cutting to keep those preformed root initials. And heel and mallet just refers to the shape or how much of that old wood you keep, a sliver versus a little mallet-shaped piece. Now, the way you tell the age of the wood when you're taking a woody stem cutting is by color. Usually the 1-year-old growth, which is out near the tip of the branch or farther out towards the tip of the branch, will be a slightly lighter color than the older wood. That's something that you just have to practice looking for. Now, that next bullet point that indicates that a stem cutting could be herbaceous, softwood, semi-hardwood, or hardwood, you're going to find that information for any plant that you look up how to propagate it by stem cuttings. It's always going to be there. That's the most important set of classifications for a stem cutting, and so we're going to spend some time on those. First, we have the herbaceous stem cuttings. These are simply stem cuttings of non-woody plants, so not trees and shrubs. They are very similar to softwood cuttings, which I'll talk about on the next slide, but basically that means they root very quickly, they dry out very quickly, and they're delicate. The tissue is soft because it's not a woody plant, and so you have to be careful not to damage it during the process of taking the cutting and sticking it. And because it dries out so quickly, you want to stick it as soon as you can after cutting it. And by stick it, I mean place it in the media and in the cutting environment where it's going to root. Now, the classic example of an herbaceous stem cutting is what you have in the picture here. This is a plant called Coleus. Coleus comes in a very wide variety of leaf shapes and colors, and it roots very easily. You don't need rooting hormone to root Coleus. It'll root anyways. You can root it in a glass of water, just as you can see in the picture here. I will say some plants you can root in water, but it's recommended that you root them in a more soil-like media, just because if you root them in water and then transfer them to a soil-like media, what happens is there's this sort of adjustment period, because when it was rooting in water, there was zero water stress going on. It had all the water available to it that it could possibly need, and it didn't even have to try to pull it up. When it's in media, a soil-like media, it's a little harder for it to take up water, even with roots on it, and so it has to adjust to that, and sometimes it may not survive. So although you can root things in water, it's recommended you use a soil-like media, and if you do root them in water, just keep in mind that you're going to have to really watch it when you transfer it to the soil-like media. You might have to mist it or water it more often or something like that. Now, a lot of your annual plants like Coleus, a lot of our annual bedding plants like impatiens and begonias and pansies, these used to only be propagated by seed commercially, but now vegetative propagation of these plants by herbaceous stem cuttings is increasing. You get a larger plant faster, and you get a plant that is completely genetically identical to the parent plant. So that's why. Our next three categories are all for woody stem cuttings. So there's herbaceous stem cuttings, which are non-woody plants, and then we have softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood classifications for the woody plants. So softwood cuttings are soft, succulent, new growth from a woody plant. Softwood cuttings are taken during late spring, early summer. And something I want you all to be clear on. All plants have all three of these stages: softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood. You could take a softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood cutting from any one plant. Those are just growth stages that occur at different times of the year. However, certain plants work best from certain types of cuttings. So a lot of woody plants are best propagated actually by softwood cuttings. So you have to take the cuttings in late spring or early summer. If you try to take them another time of year, it just won't work if it's a plant that's best propagated by softwood cuttings. They do tend to root quickly, but because they root quickly, that means they're using more energy more quickly to produce those adventitious roots, and so they require more care. Mist is really important for softwood cuttings because they dry out more quickly. Temperature has to be regulated more carefully, and they need to be stuck immediately after taking them if possible. Because they're using so much energy, they're also using water more, and so they dry out more quickly. These cuttings respond well to hormone treatments, so being treated with rooting hormones such as auxin. They are very flexible. That's how they get their name. Even though it's a woody plant, the stems are pretty flexible, and so you have to be careful not to damage them. If you damage the cutting, it's just not going to root very well. Our next category is the semi-hardwood stem cutting, and it says woody plants here, but just keep in mind softwood, semi-hardwood, and hardwood are all woody plants. Now the semi-hardwood stage is from mid to late summer and sometimes into early fall. This is partially hardened wood. So it's not as soft as the softwood cutting, and one thing that nurserymen will tell you is a semi-hardwood stage plant, if you go to break the stem, it'll bend, but it'll snap and break cleanly, whereas the softwood cutting is too flexible for a clean snap. Another way to gauge whether or not the plant has reached the semi-hardwood stage is if it's produced what's called a resting bud. If you look at the apex of a branch during the growing season, it's just going to have a meristem at the tip of all the branches. And what that's going to look like is a little growing point with maybe some little tiny baby leaves coming out of it. When that's the case, it's still in the softwood stage. Then, as the plant gets closer to going dormant for the winter, what will happen is it will form that resting bud. So instead of having a apical meristem at the tip of your branch, you're going to have a terminal bud. So it forms that bud, and once that's happened, you know you're in the semi-hardwood stage as well. As the name would suggest, the stems are harder in the semi-hardwood stage, which means they're not as easy to damage as a softwood cutting. They don't dry out as quickly, but they do still respond well to rooting hormones, so they still take those up fairly well. Stem cuttings that are still fairly actively growing, that aren't dormant, are going to take up rooting hormone more effectively and use it more effectively than dormant cuttings. So that brings us to our last category, hardwood cuttings. As the name would suggest, this is a very hardened wood. The stems are not flexible at all. Alright, so a softwood cutting stem is very flexible. Semi-hardwood is somewhat flexible. Hardwood cutting, not flexible at all. It's definitely going to break if you try to bend it. Hardwood cuttings are taken during the dormant season, so they're taken during winter and maybe early spring. So if you're taking this class in the spring semester, you've probably received your stem cutting assignment near the end of January or early February, which means you are taking hardwood cuttings. Don't forget that. You're going to have to put that on the assignment sheet. If you're taking this class in the summer, that would be a softwood cutting that you're taking. If you're taking it in the fall, softwood or semi-hardwood, depending on where you're located. Alright, but spring semester, safe bet everybody's taking hardwood cutting no matter where in the U.S. that you're located. Hardwood cuttings are dormant and they're easy to handle because they're so hard that they're not very easy to damage. Also, they don't dry out as quickly. If it's a deciduous plant, that means at this point there's no leaves on it, so there's not a lot of transpiration happening, which means it's not losing much water. If it's an evergreen conifer, well, those plants are adapted to reduce transpiration anyways. They often have very waxy, small leaves, so probably not losing much water that way. We do have broad-leafed evergreens as well, but still, even then, the plant is dormant, so it's not going to be transpiring as much as it does during other times of the year. So the nice thing about hardwood cuttings is you have a little more margin after you take them before you stick them. You don't have to worry about them drying out as much. Another thing about hardwood cuttings is you don't have to stick them inside. Softwood cuttings, semi-hardwood cuttings, you pretty much have to have those in some sort of temperature-controlled environment. Hardwood, you have a little more flexibility. Now, I wouldn't put it straight outside with no protection, but if you want to do your hardwood cuttings outside and you have some sort of structure to put over it to regulate the temperature, you can. So this is where something like a cold frame or a cloche would come in handy. If you have something like that, or even if you just have a warmer space such as a garage or a basement, your hardwood cuttings will be fine there, somewhere where they're a little bit protected, but maybe not as warm as the inside of your house. If they're a deciduous plant, they don't have leaves anyway, so you don't have to worry about light all that much, although it's helpful to always have those fluorescent lights with the cool and warm parts of the light spectrum in them. However, with hardwood cuttings, it's not that big of a deal if it's a deciduous plant. Now, you are going to bury them deeper in this scenario into the media than you typically would. Usually it's recommended that you bury them up to 2/3 of their length. That just keeps them warmer, being surrounded by media rather than air. Bottom heat is really important in this situation. You can have a pretty cold air temperature, maybe as low as 40 degrees around hardwood cuttings, but you need to keep that media temperature warm as much as possible. At least around 60 would be really helpful. So hardwood cuttings are a little bit different, and you'll notice here too that they don't have any kind of humidity tent over these. Again, they're not transpiring very much, especially not deciduous cuttings like this, but also not even your evergreens. So as long as you keep the media slightly moist, they should be okay. Now they're going to take a lot longer to root than your softwood or your semi-hardwood cuttings, and that's just part of the deal with a hardwood cutting. Something to keep in mind when you stick your cuttings, there's two things we're going to talk about in regard to the orientation of the cutting. The first one is polarity, and this is, as defined on the slide, the quality inherent in a cutting such that different responses are exhibited in different parts of the cutting based on original orientation on the parent plant. The very easy way to say this is, don't stick your cutting upside down. Now you're probably thinking, that's silly, I would never do that. Well, what if you took a deciduous hardwood cutting and there's no leaves on it? Suddenly, it becomes a little bit harder to remember which side is up and down, right? The key is to make sure the buds are always pointing upward. As long as they're pointing upward, you're fine. The problem is, the cutting, for lack of a better word, remembers its orientation on the original parent plant. They don't really remember because they don't have brains, but just bear with me here. So even if you stick it upside down, even if you treat it with rooting hormone at the top and stick it upside down, it's still not going to work. It's always going to form roots on the base and shoots on the top. So you can see the two cuttings on the left here were stuck upside down. They produce roots. Even though the bottom of the cutting is sticking up in the air, they tried to produce shoots in the media, but if a cutting tries to produce shoots while buried in media, what happens is they rot. And what will happen to the roots is they'll dry out and the whole thing will just die. So, maintain correct polarity. Do not stick your cutting upside down. They think the reason it, quote, remembers its orientation on the parent plant is that there's a gradient of oxygen and calcium along the stem, and that controls this whole characteristic of polarity. Now, when we're talking about polarity, we don't just say the top and the bottom of the cutting, of course, because plant people love to make words. So we instead use the terms proximal and distal, and there's actually a good reason for this other than just plant people like to make words, although sometimes I think that is the real reason for some of the words that are out there. But I digress. We use the words proximal and distal. The proximal end of the cutting is always the end of the cutting closest to the crown of the plant, and the crown of the plant is labeled in this picture. The crown is the place where the roots and the shoots come together. All right. So the proximal end is the one closest to the crown. The distal end is the one furthest from the crown. So on a stem cutting, the top of the stem cutting is the distal end, the bottom is the proximal end. For a stem cutting, the proximal end will always produce roots and the distal end will always produce shoots, even if you stick it upside down. Now what's interesting is when we get to root cuttings, we'll find that this is reversed. The proximal end of a root cutting will always produce shoots, and the distal end of a root cutting will always produce roots. So it's opposite for stem cuttings versus root cuttings. Now it is still true if you say the top of the cutting always produces shoots and the bottom always produces roots. Suddenly it becomes the same for both of them. But when we start using distal and proximal, it becomes opposite. Is that confusing enough for you? I hope it's not that confusing. I think the picture makes it pretty clear. Also related to cutting orientation on the parent plant is something called topophysis. Topophysis is the effect of the position of the cutting on the stock plant on subsequent growth orientation following rooting. Alright, so this has not got to do with proximal and distal ends or sticking your cutting upside down. This has to do with, are you taking your cutting, your stem cutting, from a branch that is horizontal on the parent plant or vertical? If it is a horizontal branch, then we call that a plagiotropic branch. And for some species, not all, not even most, but for some plant species, if you take a plagiotropic stem cutting, what will happen is your new plant will continue to grow horizontally. And a good example is the plant in the picture here. This is a fir, which is the genus Abies. If you take a stem cutting of a horizontal branch on this plant and root it, what will happen is instead of it growing upright like a normal fir tree, it will continue to grow horizontally. This is also true for spruces, for hollies, for ginkgos, a lot of different plants. So it's not really desirable unless you're trying to grow a ground cover version of a spruce. Then it's kind of interesting. But if you're trying to grow a spruce tree, then you're going to want to make sure that you take your stem cutting from a orthotropic branch or a vertical branch, a normal branch. Then you will get a new plant that grows upright like a normal tree. So here I'm starting to think maybe they did make those words up just because they like to make words up. But you need to know them so you can understand what people are talking about with stem cutting. So plagiotropic are those horizontal branches and orthotropic are vertical. And with that, we end this mini lecture. The next one will tell you how exactly to take a stem cutting.